All throughout the late 1800s and the early 1900s, newspapers across America ran story after story of an astonishing phenomenon, the discovery of giant human skeletons. From California to Ohio, people claimed to have unearthed enormous bones, often measuring upwards of 7 to 9 feet in length. These skeletons didn't just appear in rural fields or hidden caves. They were found in places steeped in myth, mystery, and ancient history, sparking curiosity and speculation across the nation. One of the most famous accounts came from the Grand Canyon, a place already shrouded in mystery and Native American lore. In 1909, the Arizona Gazette reported that an explorer named G.E. Kincaid, supposedly under the Smithsonian Institution's sponsorship, had found a hidden cave system containing not only giant bones, but also relics that bore a striking resemblance to ancient Egyptian artifacts. The article described underground passages filled with statues, mummies, and hieroglyphic engravings, bizarre for a desert landscape thousands of miles from Egypt. Kincaid's account noted that the structures within the cave bore the names and likenesses of Egyptian gods, suggesting that these caverns were more than just burial sites. They were temples, possibly belonging to a civilization lost to time. The Kincaid discovery became an instant legend, though it quickly vanished from headlines, raising suspicions of a cover-up. Many believe that these findings were suppressed, as they posed uncomfortable questions about America's ancient past and possibly conflicted with dominant archaeological narratives. For those who believe this story, this cover-up wasn't merely academic. It was intentional, meant to conceal a lost history. Beyond the Grand Canyon, giant bones were reported worldwide, further fueling the theory that these giants were part of an ancient, sophisticated culture. Possibly the mound builders, an enigmatic civilization that left earthen structures across the Midwest. Though skeptics were quick to dismiss the findings as either misinterpretations or hoaxes, the accounts continued to surface, each adding to the growing legend of America's giants. Some theorize that these artifacts and bones belonged to a lost race of giants whose existence was erased from mainstream historical records for reasons still unknown. The more these stories appeared, the more they began to weave a larger narrative. Were these giants remnants of the Nephilim, the fallen ones mentioned in Genesis 6:4, described as beings of enormous size and strength? This biblical connection provided a spiritual dimension to the mystery, as people questioned whether these giants were the offspring of the sons of God. If so, why had they resurfaced in America, and why was their existence seemingly obscured? To answer this question, I sat down with author and filmmaker Timothy Alberino in order to find out what's really going on.
We should be careful with some of the accounts that come out of the newspapers at the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s. There was a lot of embellishment. There was a lot of hyperbole in the papers. The periodicals were in competition, and so they would often publish sensational stories to try and captivate the audience. So it was not uncommon to have all kinds of fanciful stories being reported as legitimate news stories. Having said that, there's no way that all of the stories related to the bones of giants that appeared in those periodicals are all false. There's definitely, in my estimation, there's definitely truth to the idea that the bones of giants were being discovered in the mounds of America. I think that it's the most logical conclusion to draw when you look at all the evidence, when you look at the abundance of stories that were appearing at the turn of the century. Abraham Lincoln, of course, famously mentions the bones of that ancient race of giants that are buried in the mounds of America, something to that effect. And Colonel Powell, who was the director of the Smithsonian Institution, in a correspondence with a colleague of his, was remarking about the bones of giants being discovered in America. And he said that we cannot yet discuss, basically, and this is paraphrasing, we can't discuss this topic of giants until we can determine where they came from, because he was most interested and most concerned with the anthropologic doctrine of isolationism. And that was why he was hesitant to talk about the giants, because according to my research, the giants came from the Middle East primarily, the giants that were in America, the red-haired giants that the Indians talk about, and indeed some of the accounts of the bones of giants being discovered in the mounds in various parts of America, especially in the Midwest. Those giants, there was evidence that they had red hair, and that they were dressed in some cases, they were dressed in various kinds of armor, and were discovered with artifacts that were reminiscent of Middle Eastern artifacts. So Colonel Powell's problem, who's the director of the Smithsonian Institution, his problem was not so much that the bones of giants were being discovered, but that apparently they had arrived to the United States from foreign shores, which again contradicted the doctrine of isolationism. There was one particular article that told the story of one Professor Kincaid who discovered Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon, and there's no way to know if that story is true or if it was just a fanciful attempt by the newspaper to regale their readers with this incredible story. So I think that there is something in the Grand Canyon. I'm not sure what it is, but the Grand Canyon is an area that is it's very bizarrely guarded. There are parts of it that are off limits, not just because of geological concerns, but there's something else going on there as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if any of those stories about Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon can be verified or have been verified. Again, I'm cautious when dealing with those stories that came from the newspapers at the turn of the century. But at the same time, I would not discount the notion that you could find Egyptian artifacts in the Grand Canyon. I think that the ancients were crossing the oceans much earlier than we think. I would say undoubtedly the Phoenicians were, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Egyptians were, but undoubtedly the Phoenicians. So I would expect to find Phoenician artifacts, and indeed I believe Phoenician artifacts have been found in America.
In my opinion, this is a telltale sign of being a Tophet. Tophet was a sacrificial altar of the Phoenician people. This bowl is about the same size as an infant child would be.
So you think this was used for ritual sacrifice of babies?
I think it's indicative of child sacrifice on the banks of the Chicago River thousands of years ago.
There are sites where you have a Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script, for example, that have been discovered. At American Stonehenge, L.A. Marsuli discovered this. Well, he highlighted this in one of his films, that there were Phoenician, some sort of a Phoenician or Proto-Phoenician script discovered at that site. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then that is definitive evidence that the Phoenicians were here in the ancient past. And if the Phoenicians could make it, then it's also possible that the Egyptians could as well. The Phoenicians were the better mariners. They were, in fact, the builders, the boat builders for the Egyptian fleet, and they were the master mariners. The Phoenicians could have had all kinds of artifacts that they carried with them because they were traders. So they would stop at all of the major ports on their journeys and engage in trade. And among the Phoenicians, I believe that among the regular-sized Phoenicians were giants, were individuals of extraordinary stature. The Phoenicians certainly had a cult of giant worship, and I believe that they had some descendants of the Nephilim or the Anakim among them, because they were essentially Canaanites. And indeed, the Greeks called the Canaanites Phoenician. And that's where we get the term. So the Phoenicians were obviously a seafaring people, and we know that the Philistines were a seafaring people. There could be some crossover there. And the Philistines, among the Philistines was Goliath of Gath, the most famous giant in the Bible who David slew. And so there's ample evidence that there were giants among the Phoenicians, and that the Phoenicians, traveling all around the world, were in a sense depositing these descendants of the Nephilim on different continents, including North America. I believe that the key to understanding the dispersion of the Nephilim all across the earth is the Phoenicians. They definitely had a presence a very prominent presence on the island of Sardinia. And in fact, I would say that even in a more Canaanitish Proto-Phoenician culture inhabited Sardinia first. And among this culture were people of extraordinary stature, giants. And others who have investigated, some investigators in the 1800s and early 1900s drew the same conclusion, that there are many indications that Canaanitish giants inhabited the island of Sardinia. I myself conducted 2 separate investigations on the island and interviewed multiple witnesses, mostly elderly people who were living and who grew up during a time when the government was still concealing the bones of giants. Not just concealing them. When I say the government, I mean the provincial government in Sardinia, and also the University of Cagliari, the capital city of Cagliari in Sardinia, seems to have been involved in not only covering up and concealing the existence of giants, but confiscating the relics, the artifacts, the bones of giants on the island of Sardinia. And these witnesses were not conveying to me hearsay. They were telling me stories about digging up the bones and bodies of giants themselves. And these are not, lest anyone think that these people are confusing these bones with giant sloths or mammoths or dinosaurs. The reason why this was so popular in Sardinia, the stories of people digging up the bones of giants, was because people were actively looking for the bones of giants, because oftentimes you could find bracelets and necklaces and rings on the deceased bodies of these gigantic individuals. And so people were obviously wanting to, they were treasure hunting. They wanted to harvest the valuables from these bodies because they were so often associated with riches, with jewels, with various kinds of ornaments, even earrings. And obviously mammoths and giant sloths and dinosaurs were not in the habit of wearing jewelry. And I've interviewed dozens of people who discovered the bodies of giants in different circumstances. Some people were just plowing in their field. Others were digging the foundations of their basements. Others were officially employed by the government to dig up artifacts related to the Nuragic civilization, the ancient Nuragic civilization, and working around the Nuragi towers. And were in the course of excavating some of these sites, we're discovering entire skeletons of giants. And we're talking anywhere from 7.5 to 12 foot to 15 foot tall. So we're not just talking about 6.5 foot tall people. And most of the accounts were much larger than 7 foot. Most of the accounts were 8, 9, 10 foot giants, all the way up to 15. And they were explicit. The stories are there's just way too many eyewitness accounts, way too many people who have held the bones of giants in their hands, way too many people who have opened sarcophagi of giants in Sardinia to discount this as mere fables, folklore. And again, I interviewed individuals who took the rings off of the fingers, the gigantic rings off of the gigantic fingers, and then later on, when the discovery came to light, individuals, agents from the government or from the university would show up to their house and forcibly confiscate all of the artifacts. So this was happening, by the way, this was happening in the early 20th century on the island of Sardinia. So all the way through the teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, even up into the 50s, in Sardinia, people were routinely discovering the skeletal remains of gigantic humanoids. And so if you interview, especially the elderly people in Sardinia, you will discover that many of them, all of them, remember when the bones of giants were being routinely discovered and confiscated. But some of them will tell you stories of their own encounters with such artifacts. And again, I interviewed a handful of these individuals who were in the employ of the government to excavate the relics of the Nuragic civilization, and among those relics were the skeletal remains of giants, most likely Canaanitish giants, the Rephaim. We're talking about the descendants of the Nephilim. We know that the land of Canaan was littered with clans of giants, especially in the hill country. There were the sons of the Anakim, who were themselves the descendants of the Nephilim. The Zamzumim, the Emim, various tribes, clans of giants inhabiting the hill country in Canaan. And these were the most formidable enemies that Joshua and the Israelites had to contend with in order to subdue the land, to conquer the land of Canaan. So who knows how long these Canaanitish tribes, these giant clans, were inhabiting Canaan before the conquest. It could have been for thousands of years, could have been for hundreds of years, but certainly this seems to have been, the land of Canaan seems to have been a veritable minefield of the descendants of the Nephilim after the flood. So they consolidated in this region. Now, it perhaps wasn't exclusively in the land of Canaan that these giant clans had settled, maybe all over the Mediterranean, but certainly the land of Canaan was perhaps ground zero for post-flood giants, the offspring of the Nephilim. And I would say that the land of Canaan and Sardinia, because Sardinia certainly to me appears to be one of the primary settlements of the descendants of the Nephilim in the post-Diluvian age. I think that the giants, certainly there was a mandate from heaven, according to the Bible, to extinguish, to annihilate the offspring of the Nephilim. This is, of course, the famous genocide that happened in Canaan during the conquest. And what most people don't realize is that those clans, the ones that God wanted the Hebrews to utterly annihilate, were in fact the descendants of the Nephilim. These were the clans that were intermingled with the Anakim and the offspring of what was left of the offspring of the Watchers in the post-flood world. So there's a reason why this genocide was directed at these clans in the hill country, precisely because they were the remnants of the hybrid species that were inhabiting the earth, still in the aftermath of the flood. So there was this campaign of extermination against the giants that is evident in the Old Testament. David, of course, and his mighty men were contending with the offspring, with the remnant of the giants that existed in their neck of the woods in Canaan, in the Levant. But I think also the giants probably were bred out over time. That genetic material, those genetic markers of the giants, were bred out into the population over time. So you would have a successive generations of giants that were becoming more diminutive in stature, were becoming smaller and smaller as they were intermingling, and their DNA was being mixed into the gene pool, until it was probably very rare to have in a particular community individuals of extraordinary stature, gigantic, in other words, 9, 10, 11, 12 feet tall. So it's just the natural process of interbreeding with regular-sized human beings would wash out that gene pool and would disseminate the genes of the giants through the general population. And so in that way, the giants would have gradually disappeared, unless you had an area on Earth where the genes of the giants could be conserved, and there was a big enough population of giants to where they could interbreed, and in that way preserve those genetic markers. Otherwise, they would have intermingled with the local populaces and gradually reduced in stature over time. So, as I said, successive generations would have had less and less of those genetic markers present in their genomes. That, I think, is what happened in the United States, here in America, North America rather. Whereas at one time you had giants who were living among the native people precisely because the Phoenicians had brought them over. I believe the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes, And the Phoenicians were in the habit of establishing colonies wherever they went. And they were friendly colonies. The Phoenicians, their goal was to establish trade. And these colonies would intermingle with the populaces. And they would create permanent trading posts. So they would not be hostile in most cases to the local populations. They would want to integrate with them for the purpose of trade. And so if there were giants among the Phoenicians, these giants would have also integrated with the local populaces, i.e. the Native American tribes. And so you would have had essentially Native American giants after that integration took place and successive generations were born. And so I think that's why you find the bones of giants in the mounds, in the Indian mounds. And in the beginning, those giants would have probably been fair-skinned, red-haired or blonde-haired, humanoid. But after enough interbreeding, they would have looked more and more like Native Americans, right? So you would have a very interesting situation in which the genetic markers of the Nephilim were introduced into North America through the Phoenicians, interbreeding with the Native Americans. And that's not to say that the giants themselves were peaceful. The Native Americans they tell stories of the ferocity of the giants. Everyone's familiar with Lovelock Cave and the fact that the Indians there wanted to eliminate the red-haired giants inhabiting that cave precisely because they were hostile, they were aggressive. And they effectively destroyed that clan of giants by trapping them in that cave and killing them with smoke and fire. So the giants had they had a predisposition to violence, to hostility. There are even Native American legends that talk about the cannibalistic giants, that they were cannibals. So I'm not trying to say that all of the giants were just integrating with the native populace. Some of them certainly were, while others were probably just remaining hostile and feeding on the native populace, or forcibly taking their women and attempting to copulate with them, perhaps to some varying success, of course, depending on how large the giants were. So there's all kinds of scenarios in which we can envision the giants dispersing across the earth from ground zero, which would have been Canaan and Sardinia and the islands in the Mediterranean, I think, generally speaking. And if they're driven out of Canaan during the conquest, then they've got to find other places to live. And if they're being primarily disseminated through a seafaring people, namely the Phoenicians, then it sort of makes sense that you find the giants all over the earth, because they were distributed all over the earth through the trade activity of the Phoenicians. And I am absolutely unequivocally convinced that the Phoenicians were mining copper in the Great Lakes. We know it's a historical fact that the Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa. They were the first to do so, but I believe they were crossing the seas. They had remarkable boats. The Phoenicians devised their boats in such a way that they could be disassembled and then reassembled very quickly. So almost like linking logs or Legos or something like this. The Phoenicians, they could arrive to the shores of a distant continent. They could disassemble their boats, carry the planks through the forest, over the landscape, and then reassemble the boats in the rivers, in the waterways. And if we think about in terms of North America, they could have arrived to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. They could have taken their boats as far as they could get down the water wave. When they encountered an impediment such as Niagara Falls, they could disassemble their boats, carry the planks overland, reassemble the boats in the waterways, and make their way to the Great Lakes. Right? And so the Phoenicians were remarkable boat builders. They were remarkable craftsmen. In fact, I believe that the Phoenicians were the only post-flood culture that could still build megaliths. And they did so on the island of Sardinia, although not to the same grandeur as the antediluvian civilizations, but yet they held the knowledge. They vouchsafed the knowledge. They were the keepers of secret knowledge. Indeed, the Phoenicians were, in effect, a secret society. And modern masonry, Freemasonry, is derived from the mysteries of the Phoenicians. Who was Hiram Abiff? Hiram Abiff, who was basically the founder of the Masonic order. The Masons will say maybe that Solomon, or perhaps even go all the way back to Tubal-Cain or Enoch, or maybe perhaps Nimrod as the founder of their society, of their fraternity. But if you look at the lore of the Masons, you're going to discover that Hiram Abiff is really regarded as the founder. And Hiram Abiff, according to legend, was hired by Solomon to help them build the temple. Indeed, it was King Hiram who was hired, who was a good friend of Solomon's, who Solomon employed, and all of King Hiram's artisans to build the temple. Who was Hiram? We're talking about the king of Sidon and Tyre. He was a Phoenician king. So Hiram was the king of the Phoenicians. And these were the master masons. These were the master artisans of the ancient world, and they were the master mariners, and they were their alphabetical system is the foundation of our own. That's why we call it phonics, because it comes from Phoenician, because it was the Phoenicians who created the alphabetic system that we use today, the base of it, the foundation of it, which we've elaborated on, the Greeks and the Romans and so forth. We've all elaborated on that system, but the Phoenicians were remarkable. And there's very little known about the Phoenicians, even though they were probably the most remarkable ancient civilization in regard to their great knowledge, even more so than the Egyptians, as it pertains to their ability in masonry and boat making and so forth. Remember, it was the cedars of Lebanon, the planks that were used in the great temples in the Levant and in the Fertile Crescent in Egypt. The wooden planks of their temples and their great boats, all of everything that was made. I shouldn't say everything. Much of what was made out of wood for the royal palaces and the great temples came from Lebanon, from the cedars of Lebanon. And those cedars were delivered by the Phoenicians and worked by the Phoenicians, the master craftsmen, the master masons, the master mariners, the master navigators of the ancient world. So I believe that the Phoenicians were harboring secret knowledge that they somehow were able to conserve, that was either given to them or they discovered from the pre-flood world. I don't think that the Phoenicians brought the language from the pre-flood world. I think that they were a secret society. The whole civilization was like a secret society. Very little is known about it today, but they were essential. If you want to understand the ancient world, truly understand it, especially in regard to trade, then you have to be familiar with the Phoenicians. You have to familiarize yourself with the Phoenicians, because they are coming in and out of all these different cultures all the time, and everyone's talking about them. The Greeks were talking about them. The ancient Egyptians were talking about them. The Persians were interacting with them. Everybody was interacting with the Phoenicians. Of course, the Hebrews were interacting with the Phoenicians, sometimes on very friendly terms, like Solomon and King Hiram of Tyre, and sometimes there was hostility. But the Phoenicians are always an important element of what's happening in the ancient world, and yet we know almost nothing about them. We know a whole lot about the ancient Egyptians. We know a whole lot about the other Mesopotamian civilizations and the ancient Greeks and so forth, but we know very little, almost nothing about the Phoenicians. Of course, the most famous Phoenician that everyone is familiar with that they don't realize is Hannibal Barca, who was the greatest enemy that Rome had ever seen. The greatest enemy with whom Rome had ever contended was Hannibal. And where was he from? Carthage. Carthage was in North Africa, and Carthage was a Phoenician settlement. They were Phoenician. And the Romans were appalled by the Phoenicians precisely because the Phoenicians were in the habit of sacrificing their children to idols, to Baal, and the other Phoenician gods. And they would sacrifice their children in the most heinous way, and the Romans were incensed by this. This is one of the reasons why the Romans hated the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians came very close to destroying Rome through Hannibal. These were remarkable people, and almost nothing is known of them, even though they were, in my estimation, sailing their remarkable ships to the shores of many different continents. I get the sense, and I know this is conspiratorial, but I get the sense that there's somewhat of a conspiracy revolving around the Phoenicians. I think the Phoenicians were in possession of knowledge and artifacts that would, to some extent, should they come to light, rewrite history. Artifacts from the antediluvian world. And part of those artifacts would be the genetic stock of the Nephilim, the descendants of the Nephilim, who were certainly in their midst.